Michael Huemer, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back. Oh, it's great to be here.
Yep. I look forward to discussing free will with you. So, we're not going to beat around the bush. You believe that we have free will. What
Yeah.
what do you mean by that? What's free will?
Yeah. So, there's not a completely satisfactory definition, right? But it's generally thought that there are two things that you have to have free will. And one of them is alternative possibilities. So there have to be multiple options that are open to you, any one of which could occur, is genuinely open, genuinely possible, whatever. And the other thing is self control, meaning that which one of those options is realized is up to you. It's under your control, etc. So it's not just random. Okay. Okay. Now, the reason why I said there's not a completely satisfactory definition is that philosophers um, don't agree about exactly what those things mean, right? Like, what does it mean that there's an alternative possibility? There's something that is not in what in fact happens, what could have happened. But what does it mean that it could have happened? Okay, so there's no agreement on that. And then what does it mean that you have control over something? There's also not a general agreement on that. Okay, but we do have an intuitive notion of both of these things, right?
Okay, so to have free will is to uh, engage in an action that meets those two conditions.
Yeah. Sometimes you have multiple alternatives that are genuinely available, and it's up to you which one is realized.
Okay.
That's what it is to have free will.
Okay. All right. So there is a difference. I mean, I think the primary juncture at which views that affirm free will split is between compatibilist understandings of free will and libertarian ones. It's a big
Yes.
question, but what's the basic difference between a libertarian and compatibilist understanding of
Yeah,
free will?
good. Yeah. So the libertarian view is like what you would think of as the intuitive common sense conception of free will, right? That we have free will, and that requires that what happens is not predetermined. So um, determinism is false. The compatibilist view is no, like it could be that everything that happens has a sufficient cause, and in one sense, there's only one thing that could happen, but you could still have free will. And then and so to most people first hearing about this, that doesn't make any sense. Especially after I said that free will requires having alternate possibilities. And then I tell you, some people think that, yeah, but it's fine to have everything be determined by the laws of nature and the initial condition. And so what the compatibilists would say is, well, but there are different senses of can or possible. Okay. And so in one sense, there's only one thing that's possible, in the sense that there's only one future course of action that's compatible with all of the laws of nature plus the current complete exact conditions of the universe. Only one future is compatible with it. But, well, maybe there's some different sense of possible that applies to free will, where it's like, well, so here's a simple account, which is not what anybody currently says, but just to give you the idea, like maybe to say that I could have done something just means that if I had tried to do it, I would have succeeded. And that is compatible with the truth of determinism. There could be multiple different actions such that for any one of them, if I had tried to do them, I would have succeeded. And it could also be that there was only one of them that was compatible with, the initial conditions of the universe and the laws. Because, of course, the initial conditions of the laws would determine which of those I was going to try to do, and therefore would determine which one I would actually do.
Right, but it's saying if you had, per impossible, tried to do something else, you would have succeeded.
Yeah.
Well, and why is that analysis inadequate?
They're sort of, I don't know, they're counterexample. They're always counterexamples to any analysis that somebody gives, right. But like I think the main sort of intuitive objection is, well, it's not true that I could have done otherwise merely because I would have done otherwise if I tried, unless I also could have tried. Like just intuitively, if I could not have tried to do anything else, and that's the only way that I would have done something else, then I could not have done anything else,
Right.
And then there's just sort of general arguments which don't address that analysis in particular, but there are general arguments that freedom is incompatible with determinism. Right?
Okay, so that captures what compatibilism is. I mean, is libertarianism just the negation of compatibilism, or is there more more concrete?
Yeah, I
Detailed.
mean, the libertarians think free will is incompatible with determinism, and we have free will, so determinism
Okay.
must be false.
Okay. All right. I want to get into the argument that you struggled to publish, but developed for thinking that free will
Yeah,
exists, but just still remaining at the pedagogical level of understanding the positions in play. What is your view between the two? I take it you're not a compatibilist. You are a libertarian. So is that
yeah,
correct?
that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
and yeah.
And of
Like
the
I could give you my arguments for each part of that, but yeah,
yes, and no, and we will get into that. But of the I understand that when it comes to libertarian freedom, that free will is incompatible with determinism, and we have it. This will be relevant to some of the objections I raise later, but there seem to be two main accounts of libertarian freedom in competition with one another today, which would be
yeah,
the first, which you seem to be getting at, the alternative possibilities account, that for an action to be free in the libertarian sense, it has to be open. Other alternatives have to be open to me. It has to be possible for me to engage in some other action than the one I in fact did in order for that action to be free. But then there
yeah,
are less clearly defined sourcehood accounts that would say I don't have to have alternative possibilities open to me for an action to be free. I just have to be their ultimate source in some sense. Is that
mhm.
what is that a correct way to draw the distinction? And what is your view?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I guess like that's a different way of thinking about um, thinking about responsibility. To be responsible, you just have to be the ultimate source. But it's like, um, what does that mean that you're the ultimate source? So, right, so does that mean that um, so nothing caused you to have the beliefs and desires that you have? Like they're just uncaused causes. And do we want to say that, or so it might be getting into this agent, like how do you make it so that you're the ultimate cause? Like maybe you have to have agent causation, which I'm friendly to, but I don't think that those people want. The,
Yeah.
the
Okay. Well, I
compatibility.
think some of these issues will receive further attention as we get into your novel argument for
Yeah,
the truth of, well, it's a novel argument against determinism, you would say.
yeah. So yeah, I have an argument against hard determinism.
Right. Okay. So then I guess I should say briefly, what is hard determinism?
Yeah. So well, it's the incompatibilist determinism, right? So these are the
Hmm.
people who think that freedom is incompatible with determinism, but determinism is true, so we must not have free will.
Okay. So in a sense, hard determinists are much aligned with libertarian free will theorists. They both affirm that free will is incompatible with determinism, but then they go in opposite directions with that thesis.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Traditionally, there are these three views, right? Hard determinism, soft determinism, also known as compatibilism,
Mm.
and libertarianism. And any two of them agree about one
Mm.
thing and disagree about another thing.
Right. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
So
I
then,
think I think hard determinism is the least popular view among philosophers. I think
yes.
compatibilism is the most popular view.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And that will come up as an objection that I will
Mhm.
raise against your views. So be ready for that.
Oh, okay.
So, what is your novel argument for free will that you found so difficult for reviewers in various journals to take seriously and get published?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I actually thought of this a long time ago when I was in college, and so um, let's see. Can I say? Well, so there were 8 steps. Okay. So here's a premise. With respect to the free will issue, we should refrain from believing falsehoods. So we should only believe what's true. About, yeah, and I think that that's true about whatever we're deliberating about. Any issue that we're thinking about. But also just like since we're thinking about free will right now, we should believe the truth about it. Okay. And my claim is that you can't reject this and still be engaged in rational discourse. It's like a presupposition of the whole conversation. Okay, second premise is the so called ought implies can principle, which is one of the most widely accepted principles, like about ethics, which is roughly like to say that somebody should do something implies that they can do it. It's not the case that you should do something that's impossible for you to do. Okay, so like, yeah, so suppose that a student comes and tells me that, oh, I'm sorry, sorry I was late to class. I couldn't make it on time because whatever, my car broke down. And imagine I say, oh, well, you should have come anyway. Like, no, what do you mean? And the student says, no, no. Yeah, and like I could try to come up with other ways that they could have made it. But suppose I just say, no, no, I understand that you could not possibly have come, but you should have done it anyway. That just doesn't make sense. Okay. So if you should do something, then you can do it. Okay. Third, if determinism is true, then whatever a person can do, they actually do. Right? So this is hard determinism. So the hard determinist would say determinism rules out. They say determinism is true and it rules out alternative possibilities. So there are no alternative possibilities. So that means the only possibility is the thing that you actually do. So that means if something is possible, then it is actual. Okay, and then my next premise is just the empirical claim. I believe in free will. Okay, good. So then how does this refute determinism? Okay, so with respect to the free will issue, we can refrain. So I said we should believe only what's true, and ought implies can. So we can believe only what's true. Okay, and then if determinism is true, then whatever we can do, we actually do. So if determinism is true, then we in fact only believe what's true. Okay, but I believe free will. So if determinism is true, then free will is true. Okay, but that contradicts, because we're talking about hard determinism, so that's a contradiction. So it has to be that determinism is not true. Any proposition that leads to its own negation has to be false. So hard determinism has to be false.
Yes. It's funny that my initial impression when I read the argument was, well, this can't be right. There's no way that this simple, really readily understandable argument, if you give it a minute, can actually refute hard determinism. And yet, when you look through the possible objections, none of them are very good. And it's very difficult to say where this argument goes wrong, if anywhere, because every step of the argument is very plausible. Like that first premise one, with respect to the free will issue, we should refrain from believing falsehoods. That seems pretty good. We don't want to believe something that's false about free will. The second, ought implies can. That seems to me even more undeniable, that if I ought to do something, if it's the case that I should do X, it has to be the case that I can do X. That's good. The third premise is true by definition. If determinism is true, then whatever can be done is actually done. And whatever you do is the only thing you were capable of doing. Same thing. And then the fourth is obviously true as well. I believe that I have free will.
Mike Huemer believes in free will. I don't know if you believe it, but
I do. I want to. I want to. I suppose this is a better point.
Want to is not good enough.
I know. So why then, when I think you said at one point you tried to publish a paper outlining this argument in like 12 different journals and it got through nowhere. So what?
It was rejected many times. Yeah.
What's the problem? Why did reviewers? I mean, trust me, I get it. I get the struggle, but like, why did they stonewall you at every step of the way? Why'd they stop you?
Yeah, actually, and so by the way, this is quite rare. Like most of my papers are published. Okay, I mean, I've gotten a lot of rejections, but usually
I'm very good.
Find a journal that will publish it. Okay,
right.
And this is one of my most rejected things ever. Okay, and I think that and the reviewers would give objections, and they would always give different objections, and so like what's happening for a while was, the reviewer gives an objection that says rejected, and then I would add a discussion of that objection and explain why it's wrong, and then send it out again, and then the next reviewer would just come up with some other thing. Okay, so and then I eventually gave up and just thought, well, there's no way around this. And I think that what was actually happening was that people just found it counterintuitive. Not that free will is counterintuitive, but they found it counterintuitive that you could refute determinism, like, sort of by a deductive proof. Yes. This is like a thing that has been debated for thousands of years, right? Like, it can't be that Mike Huemer comes along and finds a proof that hard determinism is false.
Yes.
Right. So it has to be some kind of cute trick that he's playing. And maybe I haven't figured out what the trick is, right?
Right.
But,
I mean, sociologically, it's interesting that if they can't come up with a reason for the failure of the argument, you still are being rejected because it's just assumed that you have to be wrong, even if we can't figure out where.
No, they would come up with some objection.
Sure.
And, it would be an objection that's wrong, that I would have a good reply to. But you don't get a chance to apply because your paper's just been rejected. Okay, and you can put it in the next submission to the next journal, but then the next reviewer will just come up with something else that you didn't think of. So the thing is, like, philosophers, they can kind of come up with objections to almost anything. Like, if you ever think of something that you can say that a philosopher cannot think of any objections to, it was probably trivial. There was probably no point in saying it.
That is absolutely right. That is completely correct. So then what is your response to that objection, that meta objection, that this argument surely has to go wrong somewhere because it's a substantive issue we've debated for thousands of years? There's no way someone's going to come along and provide a simple deductive proof that one of these positions is actually just demonstrably false. What
Yeah.
do you have a reply to that
Yeah.
non-objection?
Well, yeah. Am I just playing a cute trick on you, right?
Yeah, are you?
And I don't think it's just a trick, but so I try to repackage it sometimes so it doesn't seem like a trick. So I try to repackage it as, well, it shows that determinism is a self-undermining position. And that is not something that's new to me. So Epicurus said that a long time ago, right?
Okay.
There's some like brief remark where he says, the person who says that all things happen of necessity cannot criticize the one who denies this, since he must concede that this too happens of necessity. I mean, so you can't criticize the free will believers for believing in free will because you think that they're determined to believe that. Okay.
Right.
Okay. And that is not unrelated to my argument, right? There's something self-undermining about it. So this was also said by J.R. Lucas. So like at more length, he elaborates more on how he thinks determinism is self-undermining. Okay. And like how that's connected to my argument is, I think that the most likely thing for the determinist to reject in my argument is the premise that you should believe only truths.
Yes.
And so they might say, well, it's not the case that you should do anything because shoulds don't apply because everything is predetermined or something like that.
Yes.
Okay. But my response to this is, but it's a presupposition of rational thought. Okay. So if your position requires you to reject all norms of thought and discourse, then you're sort of like in the self-undermining position. Now, you can't have rational discourse without, in some sense, accepting the norms of rational discourse.
Well, say more about that.
Yeah.
About why accepting premise one is a presupposition of rational thought. I mean, I think I agree with you, but flesh that out a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, well, like, what are we doing? Just like believing whatever. So, I mean, in a way, rational thought is attempting to figure out the truth, right? Related things are when you're engaged in this process of reasoning about determinism versus free will, that is itself a process of deliberation. It's trying to figure out what to believe about free will versus determinism. Okay, but it doesn't make sense to deliberate if you don't think that you have alternatives. If you're deliberating about whether to do A or B, then you're presupposing that there are these possibilities, A and B. Right. And so like in the deliberation about what to think about determinism and free will, you're presupposing that there is the option of believing in free will and believing in determinism.
Okay, but that strikes me as a different issue because when it comes to premise one, with respect to the free will issue, we should refrain from believing falsehoods. I could see someone saying, yeah, it's not the case that we should or shouldn't do anything, but I want to refrain from believing falsehoods, and so I'm going to engage in a course of action that allows me to garner true beliefs. But in our valueless, non-evaluative world, where there's only descriptive facts, no evaluative facts, whatever is just is. There's no oughts, and I just want to believe the truth rather than falsehoods. Why do I have to? The existence of epistemic norms of what I should be believing, what I shouldn't be believing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I think that if you don't think that there are any norms, I think that you must think that no belief is either justified or unjustified, or nothing either should or shouldn't be believed. There's not, like, I think there wouldn't be such a thing as reasons to believe and reasons not to believe.
Okay.
So I think, right, because it's not the case that there's a reason to do something that can't be done. And plausibly, it's also not even the case that there's a reason to do the thing that's unavoidable. Like, we have reason to obey the law of gravity. Like, it's not really true. You just have to obey.
I see.
And so on determinism, everything's like that. So then I think like, well, you're in this position where you could say, and by the way, like, oh, some of them might say this because like just saying totally off the wall, like totally counterintuitive things that reject the entire rest of our belief system is on the table for like, these, I don't know, philosophers or philosophy students who are like considering these totally radical positions. So anyway, they might say, yep, that's right. No belief is ever justified or unjustified. There's no such thing as justification.
Mm.
And I have no justification for saying this. I'm just saying this because like chemicals in my brain made me say this. Which, by the way, this is part of what J.O. Lucas says, right? Like you would have to think that when you're arguing with other people, it's just like you're just like stimulating them to move the chemicals around in their brain and make them say something different. Okay, so you could say that. I think that like I think it's self-undermining. I think that a person can't rationally believe something and also believe that they themselves are not justified in holding that belief.
Mm.
Right. So like
So I
this is related to this Moore's paradox thing where, there's this paradoxical assertion where you say like it's raining outside, but I don't believe that it is. Okay, and then that sounds crazy. You can't say that. But also like imagine saying, so it's raining outside, but there's no reason to think that that's true. All right. There's no reason to believe that.
mm.
It's raining outside, but I've got no justification to think it is. Like that sounds like an irrational thing to think.
So why think that reasons for a belief or justification, I should say, why think justification is it's necessarily an evaluative notion. To say a belief is justified necessarily involves an evaluative component.
Mhm.
I mean, on one level, you might say that a belief is justified if there's evidence that makes it 75% more, 75% likely or more or greater. And obviously that's just plucked out of thin air, but that's possible. You could just say a belief is justified if there's enough evidence to make it more likely than not that it is the case. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily see where the evaluative component, the shoulds, the epistemic norms would have to
Yeah.
come from.
Well, I mean, yeah, so suppose you say, no, I'm just believing determinism because it's 75% probable on my evidence or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking, yeah, but does that matter? And so like I think that um, that you're really presupposing, even though you don't admit that, even though you don't admit you're presupposing this, you're presupposing that you should proportion your beliefs to the evidence or something like that. Right?
Hmm.
By the way, the meaning of probability might itself be normative, right? So I think probabilities might be just degrees of justification for believing something.
Okay.
But and like there are other interpretations of probability, but if we go through them, I think we're going to see that they're not the relevant interpretations.
Okay. So what is the predominant response to your argument? I think it's probably one that you've addressed in your writing on it,
Yeah,
which is that most people look at it and they go, "Well, this is just question begging." Now, I think you have a good
yeah,
response to it, but I'll let you. What are they
yeah,
getting at? And because it was my impression too when I read it, my first thought was, this probably just begs the question. That's what it is. But then I read your response
yeah,
and went, okay.
yeah, yeah,
So what's the worry here about it being question begging, and why is it not?
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think this is the most common thing that I've heard from people who had an objection and didn't just say, "Oh, I think this is a trick,"
Yeah.
right? Whatever. So yeah, and um, so usually the claim is that the first premise that we should believe only truths begs the question against the determinist because a consistent determinist who just sort of like has thought things through would say that no should statement is true. All statements about what you should do are false because X should do A presuppose that X has an alternative between doing A and not doing A. So it begs the question to assert any should statement. Okay, now there are these remarks from Peter Van Inwagen where he comments on how like if a philosopher is looking for something wrong with an argument, they can generally find something. And if they can't find anything else, they can always point to the fact that the premises of the argument entail its conclusion and then charge the argument with begging the question. Okay. Now, it might be unclear to you like why that's the case. So I'm going to just explain that a little bit more, right? Like, so what was the reasoning for why I was begging the question? It was like, oh, a consistent determinist who has thought things through would reject one of my premises. Okay, now the fact that my argument is an argument against determinism means that if if it's valid and the premises are true, determinism has to be false. The fact that it's valid means that if you accept all the premises, you would have to reject determinism. And that means the same thing as if you accept determinism and you're consistent, you have to reject one of the premises. Okay, so the argument for why I'm begging the question appears to be if you accepted determinism and you're fully consistent and you thought everything through, you would reject one of the premises. That is true of every valid argument. That's what it means for it to be valid. Okay, presumably it can't be that every valid argument is defective or whatever, right? So this can't be an objection to the argument by itself. A better account of what it is to beg the question is, well, it would be begging the question if the reason for believing premise one was the negation of determinism. Like if I said, you said, hey, Mike, well, why should I accept premise one? You're saying we should believe only what's true. Why do you think that? And if I had said because determinism is false, then I would be begging the question. That is not what I said. Right? What I said about why you should accept premise one is that it's a presupposition of rational thought. Right. And so, okay, yeah. And by the way, like this sort of thing, like the begging the question objection, like that comes up whenever you have a good argument, basically. If there is, in fact, nothing wrong with your argument, that's what people are going to say.
Well, I'm happy you said that. I had a paper that was just accepted for publication, but in order to get there, I went through a reviewer that accused me of begging the question in one of my sub-arguments I made. And it was about methodological naturalism, the view that science should never appeal to supernatural entities in its explanations of the world. And I said that one of the arguments for this view, which I find plausible, is that you can give a good historical inductive case for adopting it as a principle of to guide your scientific research. Because in the past, every other supernatural appeal or theory has failed and has been replaced by a natural one eventually. And that gives us good inductive grounds for thinking that in this particular case that I was examining, we shouldn't appeal to supernatural explanations. We should keep it natural if we can. And one of the reviewers said, well, that's just question begging against the view in question. Because if this particular supernatural appeal succeeded, well, then the inductive case would fail. And I said, well, no, it just means that past experience with supernaturalism's explanatory failures is evidence against the truth of this particular supernatural appeal. That's just what it means.
Yeah, this just sounds like, a normal inductive argument. Yeah, it's true about any inductive argument that if the current case is a counterexample, right?
Yes.
Like, you say all A's in the past have been B's, so the next one will probably be B. And you could say, but if it's not, then that would be a counterexample to your generalization. Like, that's always true.
Exactly. So what you encountered is a erroneous appeal to begging the question in a deductive argument, whereas I found it in the case of an inductive argument. So people can do it in either situation, but so that's what I said. I said exactly what you said, and then he accepted the point, or they accepted the point. But
good.
Yeah.
I think by the way, like I don't know if we want to go talk about this, but it's unclear what natural and supernatural mean.
Sure.
Right. It's not like so like I don't know what the context was there, but like is consciousness supernatural? Yes. So if you're a mind body dualist, and so that you think consciousness has effects on the physical world, is that supernatural? I mean,
yeah,
I wouldn't call it that, but I'm not sure I would call it natural, or the let's say the physicalist would not call it natural.
Yeah, it probably implies, I think, that the natural supernatural distinction, those two options are not mutually exhaustive. There's probably a third non-natural category that something can fall into while still failing to be supernatural. Would be where I'm inclined to think.
Yeah. I mean, the etymology suggests that supernatural things are above nature. So
yeah,
conceivably something could be non-natural, but not above nature.
Yeah. I mean, this is a tangential point, but I think you're right that, well, I would say that something is supernatural if it is at least non-natural, but then also probably has to be like a personal agent with a certain extraordinary degree of causal power. It usually involves appeal to gods, goddesses, and phenomena like that. And so then you say, well, a soul was still a person on this account, but it doesn't seem to have any extraordinary powers over nature. Maybe that's the condition. I mean, I don't know. What would you?
Yeah. I mean that in the mind body dualist view, the soul only has powers over your body.
Right.
So there's interaction between the mind and the body, and particularly over your brain, so it can move stuff in your brain. Um, does that count? Right.
Yeah.
So, like, I would think intuitively, like in sort of common sense discourse, we would not call it supernatural. That might just be because we're really familiar with it and it's happening all the time.
Yeah.
And then if we didn't know about it and then we saw somebody, and you're like, because like one of the paradigm supernatural powers is telekinesis, like moving physical objects with your mind.
Mm.
But I can move physical objects with my mind all the time. The only problem is it's only my body. I'm moving my hand with my mind.
Yes.
Also with my muscles, but I moved the muscles using my mind, right?
Yes.
And I move those using whatever my brain, but I move my brain using my mind.
So it's kind of like I think the dualist would have to be more open to the possibility of telekinesis than would a strict physicalist. That seems right.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think that it's absurd, but I don't think there's any evidence for it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
for
I agree.
telekinesis, other than stuff in your brain.
Right. Okay. So that satisfies me as far as thinking about this argument. I still, if you press me, like, do you accept the argument? Do you think it succeeds? I would still just say, well, I want to hold back. I gotta think about this some more.
Yeah,
Well, so okay, I don't know that we ever really clarified that if your argument is successful, why has it eluded people for thousands of years? And why is it that determinism has remained such a, substantive philosophical question that people take seriously if it can be refuted so easily? I think there are cases in the history of philosophy where a long held position has been shown to be self refuting or false pretty
yeah,
straightforwardly. I mean, I think of the Gettier counterexamples to the usual definition of knowledge as justified true belief. People held that for thousands of years. And then Edmund Gettier came along and wrote a 3-page paper in Analysis, a philosophy journal, and showed that that analysis was subject to decisive counterexamples. And there goes the view. But those are really
yeah,
rare cases, really rare. And so our initial probability for success that we ascribe to any specific claimed case of overthrowing some paradigm should be
yeah.
pretty low. So do you at
Well,
least accept that the initial amount of
well, so
skepticism is fair?
so it's not really overthrowing a paradigm, right? Because hard determinism was always a minority view.
Okay.
But yeah, like cases of having, let's say, a decisive deductive argument against a position. There's been a lot of change in philosophical views over time. Okay, so like nobody is still arguing that slavery is just, right? Which was a common view and was in fact Aristotle's view, right? Very clearly. So, and he was like, he's often considered the greatest philosopher in history. Okay, so anyway, and then like Plato was talking about how democracy is unjust and you need to have rule by philosopher kings or something. Nobody takes that position anymore. So right, like there are cases, like there is significant progress over the history of philosophy. It's not just like a couple of things, right? Now, and like speaking about the Gettier example, like um, one of the things to learn from that is, well, like people in the past weren't as good at philosophy. So like no, it's just like in 20th century analytic philosophy, people got better at it. They got better at analyzing things very carefully and thinking things through logically, and like just trying to address all the objections, come up with all the objections you can. Right, and just like, well, they just didn't really examine it that hard before. And so, but and by the way, but I also want to say, like, I don't like, my argument isn't totally new, right? Like that, formulating it as this deductive proof in 8 steps is new, but I do think the underlying idea that there's something self-undermining about determinism, that you have to presuppose something that then is ultimately going to lead to the negation of determinism, I think that goes back to Epicurus.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a fair response. So my most pressing issues arise from objections to libertarian or what I really think are common sense views of free will,
Yeah,
especially that condition that in any given paradigm free choice, we have alternative possibilities open to us that in some really robust sense, we were able to do differently than we in fact did. That's the source of much of my angst with libertarian freedom. So I'd like to go through some of these and see. see
Yeah.
if you can address them. Some of these are more serious than others, but they come up. So
Yeah.
the first is what I'm calling the mystery objection. You do see that tossed around, at least on the
Yeah.
popular level, especially by scientists. A capacity for like really robust free will just seems mysterious. Like, where does it come from? More rigorously stated, like in virtue of what is, would you say, a object endowed with free will and one that's not different? Where a rock obviously doesn't have free will. I do. But in virtue of
Yeah.
what do I have that capacity, but this rock does not? That'll help, I
Yeah.
think.
I mean, like, my views about free will are connected to my views about other things like mind body dualism. Um, and for the determinists also, like, like there's this big faction of people who just like have opposite views from me on multiple different things. And I think they're just being crazy about like 10 different things at once. But anyway, okay. And so, like, when I try to defend my views, are like, what? That's another crazy thing. And I'm like, no, that's another crazy thing by you. Okay. Anyway, um, you know, you have consciousness, the rock doesn't have consciousness. Okay, that's the key difference. And your consciousness affects your behavior. So, like, I don't claim to really understand free will and how it works, but I think it does require something like this downward causation. So somehow the brain produces conscious experience, but also somehow consciousness produces downward effects on the brain, and then that affects your behavior. Yeah. So so like your body is a physical object, but everything it does isn't completely explained by physics, right? Because physics doesn't cover consciousness.
So, could that view with modification to what you just said be espoused by the physicalist? I mean, they could affirm that consciousness is real and that consciousness has some downward causal impact, right?
Yeah.
So, it
Well,
requires dualism, the connection between dualism and free will.
so most physicalists, I assume, are reductionists. Okay, so two forms of physicalism, right? So they think that there's only physical things, only physical events, states, and objects and properties. Okay, is there consciousness? So the eliminative physicalist thinks so consciousness doesn't exist. That's an illusion. You don't really have any thoughts or feelings or whatever. Okay, I consider that crazy. The reductive physicalist thinks no, you have thoughts and feelings, but actually they are identical to states of your brain. Right. And okay. And then, whatever, you could have different views about exactly what what the states of your brain are, what sort of physical states are realizing your conscious experiences. Okay. So then the reductionist could say, yeah, your consciousness is affecting your behavior, but they would say it's only affecting your behavior in virtue of like the physical events happening in your brain. So like your conscious experience is really identical with like a particular token conscious experience is identical with some particular token event happening in your brain, like physical events like chemicals moving around, neurons firing, whatever, and that is causing your behavior in virtue of its physical properties. Okay, now if that's the case, so then yes, they could say that your thoughts are affecting your behavior, but then I think they should deny free will, because like I don't see how like a bunch of particles just moving around according to the laws of physics could constitute having alternative possibilities or something like that.
Mm. So you think that determinism does hold in the physical universe? I suppose you could espouse in non-deterministic theories of quantum mechanics, but is that
Yeah.
why we need an immaterial component, something to stand outside the physical deterministic chain?
Yeah. So, I mean, determinism may be false, right? So the dominant interpretations of quantum mechanics, or at least the most common interpretations, are indeterministic. Um, that's not settled, so we don't really know. But I think like even if you have an indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics, that's not really going to be able to explain free will. It's just going to be like periodically the particle acts randomly, right? Because like the particles don't have consciousness. So like, and what a particle does um, can't be free because it doesn't have consciousness. Okay, so it's just got to be random. Okay, now the only way around this is to say, well, like there's downward causation. So there's this emergent property that your brain produces, like conscious experience, and that if that produces downward effect on the particles. Okay, but now, so that is my view, and like, but like, I think basically no physicalist is going to be happy with that. Like, they are not going to say that that's okay, right? And so, like, I don't know if that exactly contradicts the definition of physicalism, but I just know that they would not be cool with that.
I guess I just have some sympathy for the objection that may or may not be applicable to your view, that just postulating a soul when we can't see how a physical object could do something doesn't really
Yeah,
explain anything. So it's like, well, physical objects can't really seem to have this capacity for free will, so it must be a capacity of the immaterial soul.
yeah, yeah,
I don't know that that's explaining much because it comes down to partly that it's very difficult to know what we're talking about when we talk about the soul and actually get down to the nitty-gritty. It's not something you can
yeah.
put under the microscope by definition. I mean, is that what you're doing or is there something more subtle?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, all these physicalists talk about um, us positing a soul, but I don't feel like I'm positing a soul. Like, I feel like I'm, I'm directly aware of myself, and I think the best account of what I am is a soul. So, like, I don't think it's a theoretical posit. Actually, if anything, the physical world is a theoretical posit, right? Right, or at least there's a common view in the history of philosophy where, well, what you are immediately aware of is your conscious experiences, and right, and so right, and that's not exactly my view, right? But I think um, it's epistemically possible that there's no physical world. That is epistemically possible for me. Like, it could be that I'm only having experiences in my mind. It is not epistemically possible that there's no consciousness. And so, in some sense, yeah, like, the more fundamental thing is the mental state. And then, okay, now, um, like, most of the physicalists would say, yeah, we're not denying that you're having conscious experiences. Okay, but my claim is just like, well, but you can't understand what these are if you only have physical states and physical properties. Right? It's just not. They're just not a satisfying account of how a bunch of particles just moving around, bumping into each other according to laws of physics, constitute something feeling a certain way.
But is there a satisfying account of certain immaterial substances coming together in the right way to create a feeling
Yeah.
or qualia or a conscious
Well,
experience?
I mean, well, so the quale is the non-physical property. So, like, I'm not positing some other property to explain experience. I'm positing experience, right? And
Mm,
it's wrong to even use the word posit. I have experiences.
yes.
Like, that's the thing that I'm affirming the existence of. And then I also think that there are physical states. Like, I'm not saying there's some other thing. And so, like, the non physical thing doesn't have to explain the nature of experience because it just is the experience.
But a physicalist would respond to you and they would say, well, I'm not of certain kinds, non-eliminativists would
Yeah,
say, I believe in experience too. And I believe in physical things. But clearly there's a difference between our two views here. And it's going
yeah,
to involve where you locate those
yeah. Well,
experiences in your
so but
ontology.
I mean, the difference is that they're saying that experiences are also identical with physical states, and then I'm denying that. Now, you might think, oh, okay, so where's the burden of proof? Do I have to prove that they're not identical with something, or do they have to prove that it is? Right? And, like, so sometimes they phrase it so that the dualist is supposed to have the burden of proof because they're like, oh, our view is simpler because we only think there's one thing, and, like, you dualists think that there's two kinds of things, so you have to, like, give separate argument why there's two kinds of things. But, like, that isn't the way that it works in any other identity theory. Like, there's no other time when there are two things that you have independent knowledge of and you decide that they're identical because you can't prove that they're not. That's not how it goes. Right? Like, they give analogies like, oh, it turns out that water is H2O. Nobody's argument for water being H2O was that that's simpler. Like, there are specific experimental results, right? Like, and, like, it was assumed, actually, well, people thought that water was an element until they had specific evidence that it was something else. Or, it turns out that heat is kinetic energy of vibrating molecules. Okay, we don't think that because that's simpler, like, because you can't prove that they're not identical. Like, you have the burden of proof was on the people who said that that's what heat is. like they had to give specific evidence for that. Okay, so there should be specific evidence for consciousness being reducible, right? Right, and then and like there's this discussion in Thomas Nagel in the article "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" of how um, the the reduction of mental properties to physical properties is different from every other reduction that has ever occurred. Okay, because like when you think about how heat turned out to be molecular motion, you think, okay, um, gee, heat doesn't feel like it's molecular motion. Can you explain why heat feels the way that it does? And the proper response to that is no, I don't have to explain that because really there's just this underlying physical phenomenon, the molecular motion, and it produces an effect on our mind, which is the sensation of heat. And I don't have to explain why the sensation of heat feels the way it does because that's not my subject matter because I'm just explaining the thing out there in the world. I'm not trying to explain the thing in your mind. So I don't, right? I don't have to explain why it feels that way. Similarly for colors, I don't have to explain why they look the way that they do, or the phenomenal character of colors, or anything like that, because that's all the stuff in the mind, and that's just the effects that the physical phenomena in the world produces on you. But you cannot say that about consciousness itself, right? You can't say, "Oh no, it's not my subject matter. I don't have to explain why consciousness feels the way it does because I'm only talking about the thing out there in the world." I'm not. No, right? By definition, you are talking about the way the thing feels, right? So this is the only time when you're talking about the nature of consciousness. That's the only time when you really do have to explain why it feels the way that it does, right? And that like that's a thing that nobody can do. Like nobody has an idea about that.
Okay, well, I think I can get at this objection from a different angle. That Alvin Plantinga, for example, has argued that materialism has to be false because it can't really make sense of intentional states of consciousness. These the characteristics of beliefs, for example. I believe that there's a coffee cup in front of me. In this case, my belief has a content. It's about something. My belief is about this coffee cup. But if we are nothing but physical objects and consciousness ultimately reduces to the physical, there has to be something in my brain, presumably, that is that belief, that thought, which is about the cup. But it's very difficult to understand how a physical object can be about something else. And so that would be similar to this idea that it's very difficult to see how a collection of atoms moving around together can have free will. But then Peter Van Inwagen's counter response, I think, is very powerful that it doesn't seem to do anything to then be told that beliefs and thoughts are actually immaterial states of a soul or mind. We still will struggle to understand how they can be about something else, how they can have content. But if that's the case, then you can't really appeal to the difficulty in explaining aboutness or intentionality as a reason to reject physicalism if non physicalist alternatives also have this problematic implication. So I wonder if we could give a Peter Van Inwagen inspired response and just say, yeah, well, show me why the soul can be free.
Yeah, I mean, so what I think about this is similar to what I was saying, a couple of minutes ago. That well, I'm not trying to explain the thing. Right? So like, I don't have to give an explanation of intentionality in terms of something else because I'm just saying intentionality is a fundamental property, and so it's not reducible. So that makes me a dualist, and yeah, and then and like. No, I think I wouldn't really want to say free will is a fundamental property. I think you have to give some kind of explanation. So yeah, what is intentionality? Well, it's a property of being about something. Okay, what does it mean to be about something? I don't really have an explanation of that, right? Or why is there anything that's about anything? I don't really have an answer to that. It's just fundamental property. Okay, but I don't want to say about free will. If somebody says, "What's free will?" I don't want to just go, no, "There's no account." It's just no. I want to say something like, "Well, it's having alternative possibilities, and it's being up to you which one of the possibilities is realized," or something like that. Now, there's a point at which if you push back, and you start asking, okay, but what does it mean to be up to you? There's a point at which I will say I can't explain it any further. Okay. But I do have something to say. Like I think, maybe it requires agent causation and it requires downward causation. All right. So there are mental states that are produce their emergent properties produced by the brain, and they exert some downward influence on the brain. Right now, this is a very unpopular view. It's a highly controversial view, but that's the only way that I can think that free will can work. And also I'm sympathetic to the idea that it has to be that you, like your mind, your consciousness, is intervening in the physical world. Like you have to be causing the actions, whatever the fundamental actions are that you're performing.
Okay. Okay. We will continue to explore these issues as we look at other objections. So the second one is more commonly given in a philosophical context. It's probably the number one objection to libertarian free will, the luck objection. So here's one rough and ready way to state that. It's our actions are either determined or not determined. If they are determined, then obviously they're not free. They couldn't have gone a different way. But if they're not determined, if they're indeterminate up to a certain point, and then the choice happens, then they just appear random. And I'm no more free with respect to random choices than I am with respect to determined ones. And so the idea is that it appears to be just luck that governs the choices I make. So for instance, we might think that certain indeterministic quantum fluctuations cause neurons to fire in my brain in certain ways, causing my fist to clench. Did I freely choose to clench my fist? Well, no. No, obviously we didn't. And so merely making the action have an indeterministic cause doesn't make it free. It could just be that it's completely random. So we don't want to say that people are victims of indeterministically operating causes, whether in the brain or soul or mind, and leave it at that, because then it does look like that these choices just happen. I just clench my fist, I raise my hand, I get in the car, and there's nothing more that can be said about that. They're just as much a victim of the consequences of those choices as are people around them. I have some ideas of objection, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I rejected, like the reductionists, like why I said like the physicalist reductionists can't explain free will, right? It's like even if they introduce indeterministic, whatever, undetermined events, they're still going to say that it was just like some particles moving around randomly. Okay, but that's not the view of the dualist, right? Because the view of the dualist is it's not that a particle moved randomly. It was that you caused an action, right? Like you made a choice and you caused that choice. So it's not like something that just happened to you. Like at random, I did something. No, like I caused this event to happen. So you can't really like complain about it, like that you're a victim of this when you're the one who did it, right? And I think like you have to think about like what freedom could possibly mean. If that's not enough for freedom, then I feel like I don't know what it could mean. So like, yeah. So, and then I feel like, well, you should allow it to be something, right? There should be something, just like if I take a sufficiently radical position about what I think is happening when people perform actions, then you should admit that that would count as free action. Now, some people don't accept that and they think that, no, nothing, no matter what, I wouldn't count anything as a free action. Okay, but then I sort of think like by default, there is this concept of freedom. There's an intuitive sense that you might have freedom, right? Almost everyone thinks like that they obviously do have freedom, but never mind that. At least it seems like we have a conception of what it would be to act freely. There's something that we want that you're disappointed about when you hear about determinism, and also disappointed about when you hear about like randomness, that you're just moving randomly. And so like just you should at least try to have that be part of your worldview, and like I don't have like a super clear account of like how all this works, right? Like somebody asked me to explain agent causation beyond like beyond just saying it's when the agent causes the thing, right? I didn't really have like I don't have much to say about that, right? But I also think like just as a methodological point, you shouldn't reject something because like you don't have that much to say about it. Like there's a lot of stuff in the world that's just like that. There's a lot of stuff in the world where, well, there isn't really anything more to say. And like, I don't have an a priori belief that I've got to be able to further explain everything.
I think a lot of the issue arises from the indeterminism that is part of a libertarian conception, so that up to the point at which you make a choice at some time t, it was genuinely open to you to take one course of action or another. The world could have gone in one of two directions in the fullest, most robust sense, and yet you made one choice and it went that way. If I raise my hand right now or not, up until the point of me raising my hand or not, there's two possibilities, and then I actualize one and the world goes in that direction. There is something mysterious about why I chose to raise my hand or not. It's the
Yeah.
indeterminism. Even if we specify reasons that I did it because I wanted to make an illustrative point. If it was really truly a free action, those reasons can't necessitate me raising my hand. So there will still be
Yeah.
this irreducible element of it just happened. But you would say I just did instead of it just happened. And yet there's
Yes.
something there that is spooky.
Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, like I can't say that much more. You know, there's this thought experiment that Van Inwagen introduces where he imagines like, you know, you're going to make a decision and it's undetermined what you do, and he imagines like God, yeah, after you do the decision, God rewinds the world, puts it in the same state that it was in, and then lets the thing go forward again. And then like maybe he does this 1,000 times, and then like whatever 750 times you do Act A, and then the other 250 times you do Act B or whatever. And then he just invites you to have the intuition that after you witness this, you would intuit that it was random what you would do, and then you would feel like it wasn't free because it was random. And then, but I didn't. But I don't have more to say about that. Like why are you thinking that? So like, the agent causation person would say, no, it wasn't random. It was that you decided 750 times, you decided to do A. So you can't be complaining about that. Um, you know, but and there's not like a further account of why you should think that it was random, right?
It's funny because the first time that I read Van Inwagen's thought experiment as an objection to libertarian freedom based on this randomness idea, I had opposite intuitions about what would happen. I thought it almost undeniable that if God rewound the clock, so to speak, and placed you in the same exact conditions without changing anything, you would make the exact same choice every single time. So that it wouldn't look random, it would look determined. So I would give the same thought experiment for a different end. I don't think you would make any choice differently than what you did. Now that might be compatible with libertarian freedom, actually. And so I thought that would be a better response to Van Inwagen, that I don't see any reason to think that you would oscillate between two different options 50% of the time doing one, 50% of the time doing the other. I think you would just do the exact same things because all of the reasons and uh, operative influences would be the same, and you would just evaluate them in the same way and make the same choice.
Yeah, I mean, so you know, at this point, he's assuming an incompatibilist account of freedom. So he's assuming that it's not predetermined what you do. Okay, now you could say, well, it's actually compatible with indeterminism that you still do the same thing every time because you know it's just it wouldn't be determined by the laws of nature, right? But it could still be the case that you do the same thing, you know, in your like whatever, because you know it could be that your consciousness always does the same thing, and that isn't governed by the laws of nature. The fact that it's not governed by the laws of nature doesn't mean that. Okay. Um, so I don't know. I don't know what would happen, but like this is a thought. Um, so if you did the same thing every time, I think like a lot of people would then have the intuition that that supported that you didn't have free will. Okay, now this is a sort of I don't know methodological point. Like, man, you know, you should be open to free will under some possible conditions. Like you shouldn't have this conception where no matter what happens, you say that there's no free will. And there is nothing that could happen other than you do the same thing every time or you do different things. Right? So it shouldn't be that either way it's an argument against free will, right? Unless, of course, free will is an inconsistent, whatever nonsensical concept, right? But on the face of it, you should try to interpret it so it isn't nonsensical.
Yeah. All right. I mean, I think that's fair. There still is something about free will, I think, that is about libertarian conceptions of free will that leaves people puzzled. But I think you make the right point that like the real world contains things that seem mysterious and that are opaque and that we can't break down any further. You just kind of hit bedrock at some point. It doesn't go, it's not turtles all the way down infinitely, explanations of explanations. You have to terminate somewhere. And maybe free will is a good place to do that. Is that
Yeah.
kind of something you were getting at?
Yeah. I mean, right, so the basic thing that doesn't get further explanation isn't exactly free will. It's like agent causation or something like
Yes.
that, right?
Yes.
But yeah, but there's got to be something in the same part. Now, I think that some people don't like that, but I think the way that some people think about philosophy is sort of like it's a strategy game, and like it seems like you're cheating because it's too easy to play this game if you get to take something that other people don't agree with and say that that's fundamental, and then you don't have to explain it anymore.
Right.
Okay. But whether it's cheating or easy or whatever is completely irrelevant. I do not care. I don't care about, how this um how this comes across if you're playing a game, right? Like if it makes the game unfair or anything like that. What I care about is, what's likely to be true,
Right.
like corresponding to reality. So, okay, so is it unlikely that there is some fundamental thing that can't be further explained? No, I don't have any idea why it would be a priori unlikely, right? Like, could there be two different kinds of causation, agent causation and event causation? And then, like the proponents of like, I guess the conventional view that there's only event causation, like it seems like they attribute a super low prior probability to there being this other kind of causation, but I don't know why. Why is that unlikely? And just because like it makes my view about free will easier, it doesn't mean that it's not likely to be correct.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Yep. Fair enough. I'll give you that. So,
Whether like as a related thing, like you're constantly having people say in philosophy, like, "Oh, my view is simpler. Your view is more complex. You've got two kinds of causation. I only have one kind of causation." I don't know why I'm supposed to care about that. I don't know why it's
hmm.
supposed to be intrinsically more likely that there's only one than that there's two of something.
Well, I think what your question gets at is why think that quantitative simplicity determines prior or intrinsic probability of something. And I sympathize with the view that it does, that the more simple a hypothesis is, the more intrinsically likely it is, independent of the evidence. One thought experiment that Richard Swinburne gives is to think of finding three separate pages of what apparently look like a unified book. They read continuously from one page to the next to the next. Now, one
Yeah.
hypothesis is that one philosopher wrote the three pages together and did so continuously. But another hypothesis is that three separate philosophers each wrote one page, and it just so happens that they align in their content and they read continuously like this. It seems
Yeah.
like the first is a priori or intrinsically more probable than the second, that the postulate of one philosopher is simpler and therefore more likely than the postulate of three.
Well,
That's a very rough and
yeah.
ready
Yeah.
intuition pump,
So,
but
yeah. So I feel like this is not a good analogy, right? So
okay.
I think the fair analogy would be you heard that there are three, just randomly, like there are three books. Um, do you think that they were all written by one person or by three different people? Right. And then somebody tells you that it's simpler to say they were all written by one person. And that's all you know. All you know is that there are three books. You don't know
Hmm.
anything about their content. Somebody says it's simpler to think that there is only one. So it was probably only one. Like you should prefer that. And you need evidence that it was more than one. That's totally not true. Right? Okay. Now, in the case that you imagine, like, well, you know something about the content of the pages, and then you know that it flows from one page to the next. Okay. And then, well, there's just like a straightforward probabilistic argument. You don't have to say that simpler propositions are a priori more probable than less simple ones. You just have to say, like, well, conditional on it having been written by two different people, what's the probability that would flow? Well, like most sentences that you could start on the top of a page don't flow with
Mm.
most other sentences that could be on the bottom of a page.
Okay.
So that's improbable.
All right. I have to think about
Like I'm not against simplicity in all contexts, right? But basically, I think like, well, the appeal to simplicity is only correct when there is a probabilistic argument, right? It's just like a proxy for probabilistic reasoning. And there are cases in which the simple theory is more likely to be true, but there are other cases in which you just like can't really give an argument as to why it's more likely to be true.
Mm. Mm. All right. All right. Well, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on a paper I'm putting together evaluating some attempts to appeal to simplicity to show that if the fine tuning argument succeeds, it actually gives us reason to believe in a perfect being, not just a cosmic designer, but it actually gives reason to think that there is an all powerful, all knowing, perfectly good designer. And they will appeal to simplicity. And I've been thinking about it and going back and forth on that idea for a while, wondering if this is a good argument or not. So I'd be keen to hear what you think on that at some point. So we'll return to that.
Good, yeah. So okay, so I haven't heard the argument, but I am highly suspicious of that. That
Yeah.
doesn't sound right.
Yeah, no, it'll the problem was that in the paper, what I ultimately came around to was like, yeah, this is probably a good argument, but I think it would be more to my advantage in terms of publishing something substantial if I don't just come along and agree with something that someone already said.
Yeah.
So anyway, the next objection is one that has plagued me literally for years. It comes from Alex O'Connor and his YouTube channel. He
Yeah.
denies free will. And I remember seeing the video pop up however many years ago where he says, "We are not free," or something like that. And I thought, oh, okay, it's obvious that we have free will. This isn't going to do anything. I'll watch the 13-minute video. And then I watched it and it stayed with me for years. And I thought, oh, I think there's actually a good point here. Now, I imagine you won't think that, but still, here's the objection. We only ever choose to do something because we want to or we're forced to. It seems to be mutually exhaustive of the possibilities. We only ever choose to do something because we want to do it or because we're forced to do it. Now, obviously, if we're forced to do something, we did not do it freely. We can just take that
Yeah.
as given. But
Yeah,
it
I
also
mean,
seems like
sometimes you do something accidentally. You tried
yeah.
to do
So
A, but you
yeah,
actually did B. So it's
we
sort
only
of
ever do
frustrating.
things purposefully, I think is what he clarifies,
Yeah. Okay.
because you
Yeah.
want to or you're forced to. And
Yeah.
so if you're forced to do something, you're not free. But then if you really think about doing something because you want to, then it also becomes difficult to see how it can be an action that's done freely. Because there's a sense in which you can choose to do what you want, but you can't really choose what you want to do. So if I choose to pick up my cup or not, my coffee cup here, once again, illustrative purposes, I will do what I want to do. Say I want to pick it up, and so I do. But where did that want come from? Did I choose to want to pick it up? Well, no. It just came. Here it is, and I picked up the cup. And then you could say, well, no, but maybe you will resist your desires to make a philosophical point about free will, and so I'm not going to pick it up, even though I really want to. But at that level, your most fundamental desire is to want to make the philosophical point, and that's why you didn't pick it up. But you didn't choose to want to do that. Once again, it's just there. So it would seem that if you push the analysis of wanting far enough, of free actions, or of apparently paradigmatic free actions, doing something because you want to do it, you're not forced to do it, you still terminate in factors outside your control, the things that you want. And
Yeah.
I found that quite problematic because as you do continue to think about any free action, obviously, given this definition of want as even this second order, I will refrain from this desire because I want to make this other point. I didn't
Yeah.
choose those things. They're just here. So
Yeah.
has Alex refuted free will, Mike?
No.
Okay.
But I mean, I have two reactions I'm inclined towards, and like one reaction is, well, okay, so if you wanted to do A, and you suppose you only wanted to do A, you didn't want to do anything else. Is it true that you couldn't do anything else? Well, sometimes I make jokes to this effect, like, well, I couldn't come to the meeting because I didn't want to.
Right. Right.
And nobody else ever accepts that.
I would. I'd be like, that's a serious philosophical point.
So anyway, but I'm not really sure what to think about that because I I do see the sense in saying that you can't you can't just like freely choose to do something you have no motivation at all to do, can you? But I also see the intuition on the other side, like no, you can't say that you couldn't do it just because you didn't want. Anyway, my other dominant reaction though is no, that's like too simple of a conception of human psychology that you just like want one thing. Like no, people have a variety of motives. We have different kinds of motives as well as different motives of the same kind, right? So like, well, we have sort of inclinations, right, as people sometimes say, but we also have like values. And then, but among our values, sometimes we have conflicting values, and then we have conflicting inclinations and all that. So there, there isn't a single thing, right? At least much of the time, maybe almost all the time, there isn't really a single thing that you're most motivated to do because you just have conflicting motivations. And so it's like it's up to you. And part of what your free will is doing is selecting among the reasons that you have.
Mm. So that yeah, there are these more problematic cases where there is only one want, one desire. It's difficult to see where you could generate anywhere in your psychology a choice to do something else.
Yeah.
But I wonder
Oh, but
if you just kick the can down the road with this conflicting desire case, I might decide, try to decide whether or not I want to go to the gym, get in my weightlifting session, or stay home and continue napping. And I have a conflict of two desires. And ultimately, I decide to go to
yeah,
the gym.
yeah,
I'm deciding to act on the desire for a healthy life and good physique against the desire for immediate comfort. But
yes,
ultimately, there was a want to prefer that course of action,
yeah.
the
So
course of action of a healthy life. And did I choose that? Did I choose the want to prefer one, to place preference of one desire over another? Well, it's not as clear cut to me anymore that Alex is making a good point, but I don't know. I
yeah.
don't know. I don't know
Well,
that I
so
chose that fundamental second order desire.
yeah, I mean, so like Alex's point might be more intuitive if you have a simple conflict of desires of the same kind. Like you're at the restaurant choosing between two tasty meals, and then like one of them is a little bit tastier than the other one, so you choose that one. Okay, and then it might seem like, if the one was clearly tastier,
Right.
then it might seem like it's determined. Okay, but in your example and in many examples, there are motivations of different kinds. So there's, okay, because they're sort of like, when you're lying in bed and you want to stay there, there's a sort of different kind of motivation. There's like a feeling, there's a felt desire at that moment. Okay, but then when you think about how you should try to get in shape, that isn't really the same thing. There isn't like this felt desire, this like,
Mm.
pull that you're feeling. There's a thought that this would be in your interest, and like you have long-term plans that you've made in the past, right? And so because they're of different kinds, you can't really say that one of them is stronger than the other. They're not really commensurable. There isn't really like a single scale on which they both fall,
I see.
right?
Okay. Okay. I could see that, as if you have truly incommensurable motivations or desires, then
Yeah.
I'd have to think
And
about it. I think it's a
by the way, like, this could be a good time to mention one of Thomas Reid's arguments. Not sure what to think about it, but anyway, Thomas Reid imagines that you're there and there's two completely equally good options, right?
Hmm.
There's like two slices of cheesecake that are equally equally good. This is like the bird into ass scenario where,
Right.
but with a person. Okay. Anyway, yeah, the two pieces of cake that are equally good, exactly equal. And now, it looks like on the determinist view, you can't eat either of them, right? Because there would have to be something that determined you to take that one over the other, right? And then Thomas Reid just takes it as obvious that you would eat one of them, right? And you can't take both of them, right?
Yes. Hmm. All right. All right. Well, maybe that will tempt Alex O'Connor enough to come on the channel, and then I can talk to him and we can talk to him. I really doubt it, but that would be great. So we'll see. Oh, it's really good. It's really good. So, okay, next objection, neuroscience. I'm sure you've heard of it. So, the experiment I want to focus on is Benjamin Libet's experiments. He was an American neuroscientist, and he conducted an experiment in 1983 where he asked participants to spontaneously flex their finger, and while they were hooked up to an EEG scan, sorry. And he found a correlation between a specific kind of electrical brain activity, which he labeled the readiness potential, and then the subsequent choice to flex a finger. And specifically, and this is the key point, uh, Libet demonstrated that readiness potentials start on average approximately 350 milliseconds before subjects reported times of a conscious urge or wish to flex a finger. So, one interpretation of these results is that they indicate a brain state, a state of your brain that's causing the subsequent choice. And it's not like you're causing that brain state because it happened prior to your conscious awareness of your own choice to flex your finger. So something weird's going on. And it doesn't seem like these experimental results fit in well with the view that we have genuine free will that's up to us, especially
Yeah.
agent causal views. What
Yeah.
is your
Yeah.
take on this neuroscientific
Mm.
experiment and ones that are similar? They demonstrate
Yeah.
brain
Good.
activity
Yeah.
prior to the choice, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. Good. So a couple of things about just what happened in that experiment, right? Like he instructed the subjects to wait for an urge to flex or whatever it was, and then flex. So it's not clear how this could be a test of free will in the first place. Like you're just supposed to wait for the urge and then do it, right? Like so, is that an example of a free choice? And then the fact that okay, and then something happens in your brain, which was called a readiness potential, right? But whatever, it's just something that caused you to have the urge. Well, nobody thought that you had free will with respect to when you have urges, right? So it's like, okay, and then oh, the other thing is, Benjamin Libet is not a free will denier, right? His view is that you have free will because you could veto it. So the readiness potential happens, so you're ready to perform the action, but you could veto it if you chose. But the subjects in this experiment didn't because they weren't supposed to do that, right? They were just supposed to flex when they had the urge. So, right. So, like, it shows something that's interesting, which is that there are non-conscious processes that lead to conscious experience that happens a little bit later, right? But it doesn't show that you don't have free will.
And that's because you don't think that the actions they engaged in were paradigmatic free actions?
Yeah, I mean, like, right? Like he didn't tell you wait for the urge and then deliberate about whether to do the thing or not. No, it was just like they were just supposed to wait for the urge and then do the thing.
Mm.
So, like, how would that detect free will? Like, what was supposed to happen if they had free will? Like, no, like what happened was what would obviously happen.
Mm. So what if the experimental results had been different? Like we're just now talking about something different. But what if they had been instructed, as you say, to either flex their finger or not? And he recorded all of the results, those who did, those who didn't. And every time they did, he found this readiness potential instance. Would that call into question
I
free will?
mean, so the readiness potential would not be happening in the cases where they didn't flex.
Right.
Um, I mean, because thinking like, well, maybe there would have to be some other mental state, right? It's like the readiness potential because that's like predicting the urge, and then some other brain state happens, but before they're aware of it. Yeah, I don't know what we would say about this. I mean, like, okay, so like, what would be good evidence against free will, on my view, would be if you could collect enough information about the initial state of a system that contains a conscious being making a paradigmatic free choice. If you could collect enough information, then do enough calculations to just like predict with certainty what decision they would make. Okay, so then that would support determinism, right? But of course, nobody has anything like that.
Right. Right. So then related to this is something we talked about earlier. What about those cases where people's free choices are clearly influenced by factors well outside their control, where it begins to look like people aren't really engaging in actions freely? So, for instance, like the one you mentioned, where judges either ate prior to issuing a sentence or they didn't. And when they didn't eat, they issued like way harsher punishments than when they did. I think that's right. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah,
But
something like that.
then things begin to look quite murky. I mean, we begin to look like pre-programmed entities that are
Yeah.
just engaging in actions based on external input or not, rather than
Yeah.
rationally deliberating and freely deciding. I mean, the correlation was pretty significant across the board, if I remember. So, like,
Yeah.
what
Yeah. I
accounts for
think it
that?
was the probability of your getting parole or something. Like you're
Yeah.
much less likely to get paroled if whatever is like before lunch. I mean, they've seen several cases and it's just before lunch. Um, yeah, and what does that show? And so, like, I think there are degrees of freedom. I don't know exactly how to explain that in terms of the way that I define freedom, because like the way I defined it didn't sound like there were degrees. But anyway, it does maybe because self control comes in degrees. Okay, so it does seem like if there are these non rational influences on you that you're not aware of and that you wouldn't approve of, that diminishes your freedom. I don't think it means you have no freedom at all, but it diminishes
Mhm.
it. But I want to say, yeah, but what about the good cases? right? So like, yeah, that's a case where something is interfering with your decision making, but like your hunger or like depleted glucose in your blood or whatever. But what about when you do get it replenished and then you're like at peak operating efficiency? Then wouldn't you have freedom then?
Yeah. Okay. It has to be undeniable that there are influences upon our free choices from the external world. You've got to allow for that. And when you do that, then of course, sometimes those influences are going to be so strong that we consistently prefer a certain action over another. And that
Yeah,
comes in degrees too. And so not every choice you make is going to be the perfectly free choice.
yeah,
Sometimes it will be nearly forced, and that's why certain things, certain actions are very psychologically difficult. I think of like committing to a lifetime of exercise to gain some sort of
yes,
beautiful physique. That's very hard to do, but it's still something that can be done freely. And I don't think it refutes free will to say, look how few people become bodybuilders.
yes.
It's just that that's a very hard choice to make. And similarly, if you're super, super hungry, it is harder to make a well reasoned judgment versus acting on impulse.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, like, I want to say more about like why I said factors that you weren't aware of and wouldn't approve of, right?
Sure.
So, because there are times when you could predict somebody's decisions very accurately, and we wouldn't think that it undermines freedom. Okay, so like, if I go to somebody in the neighborhood and I offer them $50 for their house, they write up the real estate contract. I'm going to buy your house, $50. I can predict that they will not accept that offer. Okay, but the fact that I could predict that with near 100%, maybe 100% probability, like maybe if we did this to everyone in the world, not a single person would accept it, right? um, the fact that that's predictable doesn't, like, I hope that doesn't intuitively tempt you to say the person doesn't have freedom. And why not? Okay, well, there are external influences that are affecting their decision. Like their desire for money, and they didn't choose that they like money, and they like their house, and they didn't choose that, whatever. So why is it this undermine free will? But it's because, like, well, first of all, they're not deceived about anything. They know why they're rejecting it, and they approve of that reason for rejecting it.
Mm.
Okay. It's only when there's some weird thing that if they knew about it, they would think, oh, that's not a good reason. That's when it seems to undermine your freedom.
Okay. Well, then, related to this, I, here at the end of my list of objections, have two arguments from authority. The first would be related to neuroscientists and scientists. I have not even checked a single survey of scientists and neuroscientists specifically, but I'm assuming most of them are determinists of some kind or another, or at least don't accept libertarian accounts of free will. That's just my impression. So I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, we'll just look at this as conditional. Assuming I'm right, um, why do you think it's the case that neuroscientists have this view that we don't
Yeah.
have free will? I mean, to me, what undergirds my impression that they would say this is that it seems to go along with the kind of naturalistic physicalist assumptions of working scientists and the inclination towards determinism other than in the quantum realm. So I'm
Right.
probably right. But why do they
Well,
hold this view? The
I
scientists who
mean,
study the brain seem to think we don't have this
yeah, I mean,
capacity.
so I would say that, like, I would not assume that, right? Like, so the dominant view in philosophy is compatibilism. So, like, it might well be also in neuroscience. I don't know. Actually, I would suspect that most of them don't have a position.
Mm.
Most people don't have positions about most philosophical issues, but of the ones that do, maybe there would be a bunch of compatibilists. I really don't know.
Well, that's
I
what I mean,
mean,
though. Like they're not libertarians. They could be
yeah,
compatibilists, sure, but they're not libertarians. And so,
yeah, yeah. So
I
they,
could see an untutored person asking, well, if they didn't crack open the brain and see free will, so we must not have this kind of robust libertarian freedom.
yeah, but so I would say, like, um, maybe this would be a better appeal to authority. Like if you talk to philosophers, well, I actually I don't know how many are libertarians, but there's stuff that I've said about agent causation and downward causation. That's definitely unpopular. In philosophy of mind, dualism is definitely unpopular,
Right.
right? So, am I wrong about that? And well, is it a good appeal to authority to look at the opinions of, right? Because like they've thought about these things, right? They're experts as much as anyone is, you know. As much as I am, more than I am, right? Most of the most of the physicalists in philosophy of mind, they know more about the subject than I do, right? spent more time thinking about it. And so, yeah, why is that not a good appeal to authority? I don't know. Like, I mean, this is not really the kind of thing about which appeals to authority are very good, right? Because like philosophical issues that have been disputed for a long time is right. And is it so like the reason why you should listen to physicists when they're talking about physics is that that's the sort of thing that they might have really established like by some really decisive experiments, and probably the reason you don't agree with them is that you don't know experiment. If you don't agree with it, like if you think that you can build a perpetual motion machine and the physicists tell you this is impossible, probably you just don't know the evidence that shows that it's impossible. Okay, but I don't think it's plausible that that's the case about the free will issue, for anyone that like, oh, there's just like decisive evidence, and my team, just haven't heard it. They would have told us.
Yeah.
Like I would know what it was, right? And like if it's like the Benjamin Libet experiment, like even the guy who did that experiment doesn't think that it shows there's no free will, and so like it's just sort of like, well, they have different interpretations. Like I know the evidence, they just interpret it differently from the way I do, and then okay, well, I don't think that I should accept their authority on how to interpret the evidence.
That's true. That was going to be my second argument from authority, which I think is the only one that really has weight in a philosophical conversation, would be the philosophers specifically. But to give some data here, the 2020 Chalmers Bourget survey of philosophers indicates that 59% of philosophers are compatibilists with respect to free will, while only 19% are libertarians and 11% think that there is no free will at all. So,
Yeah.
as a non-specialist in the field, that gives me pause. I go, well, why? If it's the case we do have free will and it's pretty clear, there's good arguments for it, why do a majority of philosophers disagree with that position? I have
Well,
sympathy for what you're saying about philosophy and
yeah. Well,
arguments
I
from
mean, what's
authority not
like
being the right
happening
kind
is,
of appeal, but
yeah, most of the philosophers are disagreeing with me about compatibilism versus incompatibilism, right? They're disagreeing about whether freedom is compatible with determinism. Okay, and then like, well, I have arguments about why I think they're incompatible. Um, then okay, but why is this? So I mean, there can be times when you get like a large number of people being wrong about something,
yeah,
right? Like idealism used to be a popular view. I think it was a majority view among philosophers in the 19th century. Like there is no physical reality. Okay, so just think about that when you're reflecting on whether you should take the majority opinion among philosophers, right? And well, what's going on? Well, I mean, there are kind of like fads and fashions in philosophy. Is that what's happening here? I mean, like, well, just my saying that doesn't show that that's the case, but it's not implausible that that's the case, right? And that there's a kind of like, I don't know, like a broader ideology. There's like a sort of ideology of scientism, and and that like the reason why there are a lot of compatibilists is that, well, rejecting free will is kind of too radical. It's rejecting too much of our common sense worldview, so they want to hold on to that. But also, when you think it through, really, being a libertarian is going to involve some weird shit like agent causation. And that doesn't sound like a thing that scientists like physicists and chemists talk about.
right.
So it like, doesn't fit in the scientific worldview or something like that. So we don't really want to go there. Let's take the moderate position in the middle. Like both extremes sound too great. Just take the moderate position. Okay, but I think like that is an explanation of how they could come to that position that doesn't really make it like really likely to be true, right?
Right.
Like if that's the way you're arriving at the position, it's not weird that you would also be wrong.
Right. I think that's right to a large degree. Well, this is opening up a can of worms. I would have a slightly different response, but something still akin to that about the often cited figure that very similar statistics hold about atheism and theism among philosophers. Most professional philosophers are atheists. Well, only not a handful, but like 17, 18% are theists. And
Yes.
I think in general, my response to that, and what I would probably say here, is that, like, by the nature of the case, this survey was given to philosophers of all specializations and subfields of philosophy. It's not like they surveyed philosophers of mind for only those questions that pertain to consciousness in the mind and free will. They surveyed everyone about everything. Now, as a philosopher myself, this to me undermines some of its utility, because Being a philosopher makes you a good critical inquirer, all things being equal, and gives you the tools to identify readily absurd arguments pretty quickly and see fallacies that are on the surface. You can easily identify them and get them out of the way. But philosophy is so huge a field that covers so many different questions of enormous complexity that I don't know how much weight we should give to the opinion of philosophers as a whole of any sub-discipline about some very specific philosophical question that only a few philosophers, relatively few philosophers, have actually spent a long time thinking about. And so I think what you could say about philosophy of religion, for example, is that many philosophers outside philosophy of religion have not thought about these arguments and don't read publications among philosophers of religion and just don't know what's going on in that conversation at all. That doesn't mean that because most philosophers of religion are theists that it's likely God exists. I think there are different reasons that that shouldn't hold weight too. But then
Yes.
when we come to the compatibilism free will issue, I would be keen to see what most philosophers of mind, for instance, think about this. Because
Yeah.
a philosopher of law or an ethicist wouldn't necessarily have a well thought out opinion of compatibilism versus incompatibilism, for example.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just not sure. And I say this as a philosopher, not to downgrade the opinion of philosophers outside my subdiscipline about issues within it. It's too big for you to have a well grounded opinion on all of it. Philosophy is too
Yeah.
much. I mean, I don't know. What do you take of that kind of response?
Yeah, 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 good. Yeah. So you might think, yeah, philosophers in general aren't experts on free will. You should just survey the philosophers who work on free will, and but that might not work either, right? Because yeah, as you were saying, if you survey the philosophers of religion, oh, most of them are theists.
Hmm.
Is that because theism has been well supported by arguments that the rest of the philosophers just don't know about? Um, Possible, but the other possibility is that people who want to talk
Yes.
about God tend to be people who already believe in God. Yeah,
Right.
you don't believe in God, there's not that much reason to talk about it.
Right. I agree.
Um, then you might have there might be something like this about free will. Like if your view about free will is just the common sense view, then maybe you don't see much point in working on it. But if you have a radically revisionary view, maybe you do, right?
Maybe.
So anyway, but I don't know what would happen if you just surveyed the people who work on free will. Okay, but anyway, and this reminds me of why do we care about what the majority view is about something? Well, there's like this resultant probability theory called the Condorcet jury theorem, which gives you the
Oh,
probability of
yes.
a majority being correct as a function of how much the majority outnumbers the minority, and you get really high probabilities for fairly small margins. Like if the majority contains 10 more people than the minority, you get a super high probability that the majority is correct. Okay. However, that assumes that the judgments made by the people in the majority are probabilistically independent of each other.
Ah,
Right. So, yeah. So each of them is just completely independently coming to this. But that is not what happens in philosophy.
I see.
Okay. And by the way, probabilistic independence is stronger than just causal independence. Okay. Like, actually, there are many times when huge numbers of people are wrong. And if you just took the jury theorem and like you take this assumption of independence at face value, like it's super improbable that there are all these times when the vast majority of people are going wrong. The reason it's not is that they're not probabilistically independent. Okay, and so like one of the reasons is, well, there could be a problem where the thing that's not true just has an appearance of plausibility or whatever. Like you might call this illusions.
Mm.
So there are sensory illusions where like there's a whole bunch of people are going to see the sensory illusion, they're going to make the wrong judgment. Okay, and it's not because they're conferring with each other either, right? They don't have to have gotten the judgment from each other. It's just that there's a feature of the situation that's misleading. Okay, so it could well be with respect to certain philosophical issues that there's some feature of the situation that's misleading or that like would just give an appearance of something where okay, and then maybe it just requires much more thinking, much more subtle thinking to get around that appearance. Okay, so that is how it can be that large numbers of people just converge on something that's not true.
I see. And so, what is the to make the point explicit? What's the lack of independence among professional philosophers? I mean, is it just the fact that they convene and talk about these things and socialize with one another?
Yeah, Yeah, well, yeah, one thing is that philosophers influence each other. But I was thinking like this thing that I was saying about how philosophers became compatibilists. This is speculation. I don't know, but the plausible speculation that it's sort of like they wanted to take the moderate position. Because hard determinism is too revisionary of our sort of stuff that we just say in ordinary life.
Yeah.
But then libertarianism seems like it requires this metaphysics that just doesn't resemble the sort of stuff that you hear in natural science. And there's a kind of ideology of scientism where like, we have to follow what the scientists are saying. Okay. And so there's sort of like a broad feature of our culture, our intellectual culture, right? That is this scientism and stuff, and that you're not supposed to say weird stuff. And also like there's a general feature of people that they don't like to take extreme positions.
Mm.
Right? And so like, well, that could be influencing all these philosophers in the same way.
All right. Fair enough. Much to think about. Michael Huemer, that was all my questions. Thank you for this
Cool.
conversation on free will. It leaves me thinking deeply about these things. And my personal credence in free will after talking with you is higher than when we started. So I will count that as a win.
Oh, great. Me too.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me. And it was great talking to you.
absolutely.